Hello, my name is Kristen Bolden, and I'd like to welcome you to The Other Side of History. Now, in this talk, we are going to give a more in-depth history on Cardinal Wolsey. Pope Adrian VI. He died on the 14th of September, 1523, before the end of the second year of his pontificate. Now, Cardinal Wolsey, the Chancellor of England, thought of himself as Pope. He felt that his time had come to no longer be the favorite only, but the arbiter of the kings of the earth. He felt that his genius, for which England was too narrow, would have Europe and the world for its stage. Gigantic projects rolled around in his mind. He dreamt of the destruction of heresy in the West, and in the East, to have new crusades to replant the cross on the walls of Constantinople. Now, if Cardinal Wolsey had been seated on the throne of Catholicism, there would have been nothing that he would have not dared to undertake. With the Pope being dead, Wolsey, he got King Henry VIII to send a letter to the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, suggesting that Wolsey be made the next pope. Henry's ambassadors told the cardinals that the legate of England, which was Cardinal Wolsey, is the very man for the present time. He is the only one thoroughly acquainted with the interests and wants of Christendom, and strong enough to provide for them. He is all kindness, and will share his dignities and wealth among all the prelates who support him. End quote. However, at this time, Giulio de' Medici himself was aspiring to the papacy. If you have not heard my talk on the Medici family, I would encourage you to go back and to listen to that talk. Giulio de' Medici had 18 cardinals that were devoted to him, and the election could not take place without his support. A month passed away, and nothing was done. New intrigues were resorted to, and there were those who supported Cardinal Wolsey and those who supported Medici. Finally, in November of 1523, the people collected under their windows, and they shouted, "No foreign pope." After 49 days of debating, Giulio was elected, and, as he said, he bent his head beneath the yoke of apostolic servitude. Giulio took the name of Clement VII. Cardinal Wolsey, he was exasperated. Wolsey had been given the place of master of England and was the most influential of European diplomats. He saw men preferred to him as his inferiors. But the reality was that there was always a more active or more fortunate rival taking the Pope's chair before him. Before Pope Adrian had been chosen, Wolsey, he tried to become the newly elected Pope. But the Italian factions, they were then also against him. Adrian had been serving the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, as his regent in Spain, and in the end, Charles V elected Adrian as Pope. Cardinal Wolsey was crafty, and being rejected, he declared to Henry that the new election was quite in conformity with his wishes. He hastened to congratulate the new pope. Writing to his agents at Rome, he said, "This election, I assure you, is as much to the king's and my rejoicing, consolation, and gladness as possibly may be devised or imagined. Ye shall show unto his holiness what joy, comfort, and gladness it is, both to the king's highness and me, to perceive that once in our lives it hath pleased God of his great goodness to provide such a pastor unto his church, as his grace and I have long inwardly desired, who for his virtue, wisdom, and other high and notable qualities we have always reputed the most able and worthy person to be called to that dignity. End of quote. The Pope, divining his competitor's vexation, he sent to King Henry a golden rose and to Cardinal Wolsey a ring. Popedom and England, they embraced each other, and nothing appeared more distant than the Christian Revolution, which was about to happen in England. Wolsey's disappointed ambition in being made Pope made him suspend the orders of the clergy to deal with some of the learned doctors at Cambridge. Wolsey had revenge, actually, in his heart, and he cared not to persecute his fellow countrymen merely to please his rival. Besides, Wolsey had a certain fondness for learning. To send a few lollards to prison was one thing, but to learn doctors, he felt that this required a closer examination. Thus, Wolsey gave Rome a sign of independence. Wolsey, viewing Clement as just more fortunate than himself in becoming Pope, directed his hatred towards the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. Drop by drop, he distilled his hatred of Charles V into King Henry VIII's mind. Charles discovered this hatred that lay hid under Wolsey's apparent mildness, and desiring to retain King Henry's alliance, he made more pressing advances to the king. Charles said, "You are King of France, and I undertake to win your kingdom for you. Only send an ambassador to Italy to negotiate the matter." End of quote. Wolsey, who could hardly contain his vexation, was forced to comply, in appearance at least, with the emperor. Charles V, his fiercest enemies were France and its king, Francis I. Wolsey openly gave his right hand to Charles V and secretly his left hand to Francis I. Now, on February 24 of 1525, the Battle of Pavia was fought, and the Imperialists found in the French king's tent several of Wolsey's letters, and in his military chest and in the pockets of his soldiers, Cardinal Wolsey's corrupting gold. The outcome of the battle was the capture of the King of France, Francis I. The next year, Francis was liberated under the condition that France abandon its claims on the Duchy of Milan and Duchy of Burgundy to the House of Habsburg. The English attack on North France was small and made little ground. After Charles defeated and captured Francis at Pavia and was able to dictate peace, Charles believed that he did not owe King Henry a thing. Henry had sensed this and had taken England out of the war before the Emperor Charles did, and Henry also signed the Treaty of the Moor in August of 1525. The result of the treaty was that England, with Wolsey negotiating, agreed to give up some territorial claims on France and received in return a pension from the French of £20,000 a year. Now, King Henry was not exactly happy about the loss of his royal jurisdiction in France, and for the first time resolved not to spare his minister, Cardinal Wolsey. Henry told Wolsey that there are loud murmurs throughout this kingdom. It is asserted that your new college at Oxford is only a convenient cloak to hide your corrupting behavior in a position of trust. Now, Wolsey denied such claims and then cunningly insinuated that by his will he left all his property to the king. And Henry, he was satisfied and he backed off. Now, Wolsey continued his hatred towards the emperor. He told Henry, Charles is aiming at universal monarchy. Pavia is the first step of this throne, and if England does not oppose him, he will attain it. End quote. Wolsey prevailed upon Henry to conclude between England and France an indissoluble peace by land and sea. End quote. So the English, however, desired to conquer France. Wolsey said, You desire to conquer France. You are right. Give me then, for that purpose, the 6th part of your property. That is a trifle to gratify so noble an inclination. End quote. England didn't think so, however. This illegal demand, it aroused universal complaint. We are English and not French, freemen and not slaves, was the universal cry. Henry might be able to tyrannize over his court, but he would not lay hands on his subjects' property. The eastern countries, they rose up in insurrection. 4,000 men took up arms, and King Henry was guarded in his palace by only a few servants. The bridges were broken down to stop the insurgents. The courtiers complained to King Henry, who threw the blame on Cardinal Wolsey. And Wolsey laid the blame on the clergy, who had encouraged him to impose this tax by quoting to him the example of Joseph, demanding of the Egyptians the 5th part of their goods. The clergy, they put the blame on the gossipers, who they said were stirring up a peasant war in England as they had done in Germany. The accusation was that the Reformation produces revolution. The blame of violent hands was laid upon the heretics. This charge of the priests was untrue and absurd. But people, they are blind whenever the gospel is concerned, it seems, and governors can also be blind. The preaching of God's word is not the cause of rebellion. The year of 1524 was not only memorable for the Battle of Pavia, but by a still even more important victory. Aubigne tells us that in the spring of 1525, William Tyndale, who had traveled to Germany, had an interview with Luther and other learned men of that country. Now, Tyndale wished to have his translation of the Bible printed, and there was at Cologne a celebrated printer, well known in England, and his name was Quentel. Now, Tyndale decided to go to Cologne to have his printing done. However, the Reform movement, then at work in Germany, had broken out at Cologne, and the Archbishop had just forbidden all evangelical worship. They arrived in the gloomy streets of the city with its innumerable churches, ancient cathedral, and many priests, monks, and pilgrims who, from all parts of Europe, poured in to adore the pretended relics of the 3 wise men and the 11,000 virgins. Tyndale had asked himself, whether it was really from Cologne that the New Testament was to be printed in English. Yet Tyndale, he persevered, and submitting to the most minute precautions not to compromise his work, he took an obscure lodging where he kept himself closely hidden. Calling on the printer, Quentel, Tyndale, he ordered 6,000 copies, and then, upon reflection, he sank down to 3,000 for fear of a seizure. The printing started. One sheet followed another, and gradually the gospel, it unfolded its mysteries in the English tongue. Tyndale could hardly contain himself with joy. He saw in the future the triumphs of the Scriptures over all of England. He exclaimed with joy, "Whether the king wills it or not, ere long all the people of England, enlightened by the New Testament, will obey the gospel." End quote. However, the sun was to be hidden by thick clouds. One day, just as the 10th sheet had been thrown off, the printer hastened to Tyndale and informed him that the Senate of Cologne forbade him to continue his work. Everything had been discovered. Tyndale knew that King Henry VIII had burnt Luther's books and would wish to burn the English New Testament and him too. Who had betrayed him? Tyndale wondered. On every occasion when persecution takes place, those who witness it make decisions either for Christ or against him. Those who manifest sympathy for the ones wrongly condemned show their attachment for Christ. Others are offended because the principles of truth cut directly across their practice. Many stumble and fall, apostatizing from the faith which they perhaps once advocated. Those who apostatize in time of trial will, to secure their own safety, bear false witness and betray their brethren. Christ has warned us of all of this, that we may not be surprised at the unnatural, cruel course of those who reject the light. Now, it was one of the printing workers who had betrayed William Tyndale, but we are going to have to discuss that more in our next talk. In this great controversy between good and evil, it is the few who are on the side of good and the right. Even the assistant of William Tyndale, his name was William Roy. He was a man who, while not wanting to be under the yoke of Rome, was not attracted by the Spirit of God to Christ. He is described as an acute, insinuating, and crafty man. He had pleasing manners and charmed all those that had casual relationships too with him. However, Roy, who was pretty manageable while he had no money, had become intractable when his purse was less empty. Tyndale had spent £10, the £10 that he had brought from England, and could not satisfy the demands of his assistant and pay his own debts. So Tyndale became still more sparing and economical. Actually, Wartburg Castle, where Martin Luther had translated his New Testament, was a palace in comparison with the lodgings in which Tyndale had to work. Now, in this talk, we can see there are two opposite kinds of men that are represented. There was the Cardinal Wolsey, who on the outside appeared very beautiful, but within his character was full of uncleanness. His exterior was meant to conceal the corruption that was within. He was a persecuting power for the Bible-believing Christians, and their blood was on his hands. Then there was William Tyndale, who spent all of his time, money, and labor in giving to our world the purity of the Bible in the English tongue. I want to belong to the class of people like the Protestant reformer Martin Luther and William Tyndale, who lived for Christ and the truth that is revealed within his holy word. Don't you? I hope that you have enjoyed this talk. If you have, I would encourage you to go back and to listen to other talks in this series. I want to thank you for listening, and I'm wishing God's blessings to each one of you.